reflecting more on Donald Trump's UN speech. I want to play a little bit more of it and talk about it. Let's go to clip number 5.
If we desire to lift up our citizens, if we aspire to the approval of history, then we must fulfill our sovereign duties to the people we faithfully represent. We must protect our nations, their interests, and their futures. We must reject threats to sovereignty from the Ukraine to the South China Sea. We must uphold respect for law, respect for borders, and respect for culture, and the peaceful engagement these allow.
Okay, let's hold that.
And just as the founder...
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I'm fascinated always by Donald Trump's choice of nations here. We must reject threats to sovereignty from the Ukraine. It's Ukraine, by the way. It's not the Ukraine anymore. At least he didn't make up an entire new country like Nambia, but as he did at another point. But we must reject threats to sovereignty from the Ukraine to the South China Sea. Interesting in that he's basically going after Asia, and he's going after the very sensitive issue of Ukraine's bid to resist Russia, and the counterbid from the Russians in Ukraine to the Russian people of descent in Ukraine to reaffiliate with Russia. So he's getting into, you know, some issues. I'm not, I believe in terms of conspiracies, wait and see, but it was interesting there that he mentioned Ukraine. That jumped out at me. And then later on, I think I'm going to pick out, clip number 8. Can we play that?
The Iranian regime's support for terror is in stark contrast to the recent commitments of many of its neighbors to fight terrorism and halt its finance. In Saudi Arabia early last year, I was greatly honored to address the leaders of more than 50 Arab and Muslim nations. We agreed that all responsible nations must work together to confront terrorists and the Islamic extremism that inspires them.
Okay, let's cut that there.
We will stop radical...
Now, interesting also, another interesting mention here, Saudi Arabia. Okay, you know, he goes on to condemn Iran for its exportation of terrorism in his words, but Saudi Arabia, where most of the terror funding for Al-Qaeda, for example, was traced back to, not from the government, but from sources there. Many people feel the government has been turning a blind eye to that and encouraging clerics who in turn encourage terrorism in Saudi Arabia. So he mentioned Saudi Arabia, but very, very odd when you think about it. He also, in the audio that we uncovered and released on this program of his private speech to a fundraiser, he also stood up for Saudi Arabia and its border conflict with Qatar. So here this guy is getting into the Middle East, always on the side of, in one, he seemed to be siding with Russia in the clip we played before. Now he seems to be siding with Saudi Arabia against Iran, and they are at loggerheads as he sided with Saudi Arabia against Qatar. You know, I'd like to see somebody investigate Donald Trump's financial ties to Saudi Arabia, because I think you would find very, very interesting things there and things that we would want to know more about. Now I want to play one more clip before we go. Clip number 13. No, clip 13. Okay, well, I will read to you what clip 13 says. It says, patriotism led the Poles to die to save Poland, the French to fight for a free France, and the Brits to stand strong for Britain. Now, what's interesting about that, to me, is the fact that he leads with Poland. His speech in Poland was greeted with great cheers and an enthusiastic reception from Polish nationalists who include a number of white supremacists there, and enormous hostility to foreign influences or Jewish influences historically. And of course, Poland there were many people in Poland who sided with the Nazis. It was very odd. Of all the countries of the world that are larger, that more important, that he gave a higher priority to Poland and Poles dying to save Poland. Elsewhere, he's spoken about preserving Polish culture. You'll note the use of the word culture earlier in the speech, before he even mentioned our traditional allies of the French and the British, as they are normally called, rather than the Brits when in a diplomatic setting. This guy, you know, I want to know his very strange alliances here when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to the Middle East, and when it comes to white nationalists everywhere. He's talked a lot. There's a Steve Bannon influence even in this speech, although Steve Bannon is gone. He uses culture the way white supremacists and nationalist extremists use the word culture as a code word for white only, at least that's the way it feels to me. I want to know a lot more about this guy.